We believe in the resurrection of the dead. We boldly and confidently proclaim these words every time we confess our faith with the words of the Apostles and the Nicene Creed. And in confessing these words, we're really claiming that we have the hope that when death takes us from this life, that we will then be joined and united with all of the believers who have gone before us in heaven, and will one day be joined and united with all of the believers who one day come after us as well. But as we think about these words and the hope that we confess, can we really be certain that this hope will be a reality one day in the future? In other words, when we confess these words, can we really be confident in what we're saying? Or are we simply deceiving ourselves as we go through this life, knowing that death is fast approaching, so that we can have some semblance of hope in this life? Now, leading up to our verses for today, we hear about a woman who lived in Shunem who was very faithful to God and very generous towards God's prophet Elijah and his servant Gehazi. This woman and her husband, whenever Elisha and Gehazi passed through the town, would invite them in for a meal. And while this was extremely generous of them to do, this woman went above and beyond, and she even had a separate residence constructed amongst their house that would serve as a residence for Elisha and Gehazi to stay at whenever they passed through this area. And because of how generous this woman had been, Elisha desired to give this woman a gift of thanks for her faithfulness. And this woman could have asked for or requested whatever she desired. But not only does this woman deny Elisha's request to speak to the king on her behalf, which would give her a prominent position at court, she doesn't ask for or request anything. And so Elijah took it on himself to find what gift he could give to this woman that would show his deep appreciation for what she had done. And when Gehazi, his servant, reminded him that this woman had no son and that her husband was old, well, Elisha knew the perfect gift that he would give to this woman. He promised her that next year, around this time, she would hold a son in her arms. And upon hearing this news, the woman told Elijah, "Don't deceive your servant." Now, the woman wasn't being ungrateful in saying these words. The woman was overjoyed at hearing this promise that Elijah had given to her. But this woman had hoped for and desired to have a child for so many years. But because she was barren, well, this hope was never realized. And because of this, she had completely given up hope that this would ever be a reality. And hearing Elisha's promise to her restored that hope, which she didn't want to be crushed if this promise wouldn't be fulfilled. But because it was ultimately God that was giving her this promise, this was not some false hope that he was giving to her. And we hear in our verses for today that this wonderful promise is fulfilled. The woman conceived and she gave birth to a son at that time of the year, just as Elisha said to her. And God shows himself to be gracious and powerful in granting this barren woman a son after all of these years. And really, with this wonderful gift, God was nourishing this woman's faith with how faithful she had been and how generous she had been to Elisha and Gehazi. And how wonderful this account would be if it ended here. A beautiful story of God blessing a faithful believer with a wonderful gift and everybody living happily ever after. But our account for today doesn't end here. And as our account continues, we see it take a dramatic turn for the worst. After some years had passed, we hear that the boy grew up, and one day he went out to his father who was with the reapers. And he said to his father, "My head, my head." His father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." So he picked him up and carried him to his mother, and the boy sat on her lap until noon. Then he died. It just seems so cruel for God to allow something like this to happen. I mean, after all of those years of this woman hoping and praying that she would finally have a son, God grants this hope, only to have it taken away from her so suddenly and tragically, even after giving her years of being able to care for and provide for her son. And it seems like what took place was the boy was working in the field with his father on a hot summer day when he suffered a stroke. And how difficult it must have been for the mother to hold her son in her arms for who knows how long, hoping and praying that he was going to be okay, only to have him die right there in her arms. What must have been going through her mind at this time? Why did you give me a son, God, when I didn't even ask for one, if you knew that this is what was going to happen? Didn't I say, don't give me false hope, and don't deceive me, because I didn't want my hope to turn to sadness and grief? What would you have done if you were in a situation similar to this woman? What if you had been praying for a loved one who was fighting cancer, and after praying for them for day in and day out, and after all the treatments and procedures, you finally hear the good news from the doctor that they're completely cured, only to hear a few years later that the cancer has returned and there's no hope of treating it? What would you do if you were in a situation like this? While we know the right thing to do is to go to God and to trust in His will, and to know that His will is always going to be done. But how difficult it can be to trust in God's will when He allows something like this to happen. And how easily we can fall into the temptation to lash out at God and to be angry with Him for allowing tragedies like this to take place in our lives. While it can be so difficult, we need to keep in mind and remember Paul's words that he wrote to the Romans. His words where he told them that God is always working for the good of those who love Him. Always. And with these words, God isn't promising that He'll grant His believers perfect lives here in this world, that they'll have lives that are empty of all kinds of tragedies and hardships. You know, what God is promising His believers with these words is that through every situation in their lives, in your lives, through the ups and downs, through the good times, and even through the tragedies and hardships, God is always working for your eternal good. And we know that this is true because God has fully revealed His will to us in sending His own Son to take on flesh and to come into this world so that He could live the perfect life that we never could, so that He could walk to the cross and take on all of our sins, so that He could tragically suffer and die the punishment that we deserved to redeem us from all of our sins. And because we know that God has fulfilled this promise to us, we know that when we experience tragedies in our lives, God is not punishing us for some sin that we've committed. Those have all been punished on Christ. We know that God isn't being unfair in what He's allowing us to endure. Instead, what God is doing is He's working for our eternal good. And through this tragedy, God is putting our faith to the test, leading us to trust in Him, leading us to have faith that gets strengthened and going to him for hope, for help, and for comfort. And this is what God was doing for the woman in our verses for today in allowing her to undergo this awful tragedy. And as our verses continue, we see how the woman responds to this test of faith. After laying her son down, she called to her husband and said, "Send one of the servants to me with one of the donkeys, so that I can run to the man of God and come back." When faced with this awful tragedy, the woman's first response wasn't to go to God to be angry at him and to lash out at him in anger. No, we see the woman's faith shine in that her first response was to go to God and to seek him out for help. Because this woman knew that God is the one who had graciously blessed her with this son after so many years. And she knew that now that her son had died, that God is the only one who could help her in this tragic situation that she found herself in. And when the man of God, Elisha, saw her from a distance, he said to his servant Gehazi, "Look, that's the woman from Shunem. Now run to meet her and say, 'Are you all right? Is your husband all right? And is your son all right?'" Now God hadn't revealed anything to Elijah, so he was kind of blind going into this situation. But seeing that the woman from Shunem was approaching from that far distance away, he assumed that something must have been wrong. And so he sent his servant Gehazi to ask if it had anything to do with her family. And the woman responds in kind of a shocking way. She responds to all the questions saying, "We're all right," which was so far from the truth. But the reason for this response is because she only wanted to bring up her situation to God's prophet and him alone. And when she came to the man of God at the mountain, she grasped his feet. And Gehazi stepped forward to try to push her away, but the man of God said, "Leave her alone, for her soul is in distress. But the Lord has hidden it from me. He has not told me." Then she said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Didn't I say, 'Don't give me false hope'?" The woman's response here had so many different emotions that were behind it. Grief over the fact that her son was now dead. Frustration over the fact that it seemed like God had set her up with so much hope only to completely crush it by taking her son away. But behind her response was also complete trust that God is the one who would be gracious and willing to help her son and restore his life back to him. In hearing what her problem was, surely Elisha must have hoped that God was going to work through him to somehow restore this boy's life. And so Elisha devised a plan. He called for Gehazi to hasten to Shunem, not wasting any time, and to put his staff on the boy's face. And Gehazi went as quickly as he could, and when he got there, he put the staff on the boy's face. But the boy remained lifeless. And so Gehazi went back to Elisha and told him, "The boy didn't wake up." How frustrated Elisha must have felt now, and how Elisha's hope must have also been crushed, thinking that surely God was going to work through him. And not only had God now allowed the woman to suffer this awful tragedy, it looked like God had abandoned him in trying to give this woman the help that she so desperately was seeking after. But Elisha remained persistent. When he came to the house, he prayed to the Lord. Then he got up and lay on top of the boy. Then he bent down over him, and the boy's flesh became warm. But the boy was still lifeless and unsure of what to do. Elisha then went back into the house and paced back and forth for a time. Then he went back to the boy, bent down over him again, and the boy sneezed 7 times. Then the boy opened his eyes. But after letting this woman grieve for quite some time. And after allowing Elisha to have failed attempts at bringing this boy's life back to him, God finally, graciously restores this boy from dead to life. And Elisha called the woman of Shunem in to see her son. And when she came in, she showed her thanks to Elisha and ultimately to God by falling at Elisha's feet and bowing to the ground. At the beginning of this account, God had nourished this woman's faith in providing her with a son. And now in allowing the woman to wrestle with the tragic loss of her son, God had now strengthened her faith, leading the woman to see that He is worthy of her trust, her hope, and her praise, proving that He has the power over life and death. But the thing with the miracle that we see in our verses for today, and even the miracle that we heard about in our gospel reading for today with Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead, is they didn't live forever. Both this boy and Lazarus only lived for a time when death would eventually take them once again. And that's because the miracles that we see take place in the readings that we have before us today is they didn't get rid of the roots of the problem. Yes, they restored them back to life, but both this boy and Lazarus still needed to be cured of their problem of sin. As we continue to walk with Jesus during this Lent season, it's really a good reminder for us to see why death is a reality for each and every one of us. That all the way back in the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve disobeyed the one command that God had given them. And through this act of disobedience, sin entered. And God told Adam and Eve what the ultimate consequence of this sin would be. That surely you will die. And this consequence is something that each and every one of us will face at some point in our lives. And as the years go on, maybe the reality of death becomes more and more apparent. Maybe earlier in your life, it was apparent with the fact that you maybe went to some funerals for older relatives and loved ones. Maybe it's become even more apparent as the funerals you've gone to maybe are no longer for older relatives and loved ones, but maybe are for friends and siblings. Or maybe death is very apparent in your life as the aches and pains continue to grow, and the frailty of your life is maybe at the forefront of your mind. Even though death is a reality for each and every one of us and something that each and every one of us will face at some point, this doesn't mean that we can't face it without hope. Because just as Jesus went to the cross to take on all of our sins and suffer the punishment that we deserved by giving up His own life, redeeming us from all of our sins, this was the end of Jesus' story. That we know 3 days later He rose from the dead. And this miracle, and this amazing event, gives us the assurance and gives us the hope in knowing that because our Savior lives, we too will also live as well. Because His resurrection is the stamp of approval that what He accomplished on the cross was fulfilled. That Jesus promised that He is the way and the truth and the life. And because this is who Jesus is, and because this is what Jesus has done for us, we can confess boldly and confidently that we believe in the resurrection of the dead. And we can know that this is not some empty hope or some false promise that God has given to us. We can be assured and know that this is what the future holds for us, because God has given us a promise. And God has fulfilled that promise through the work of His Son. May we always hold on to this truth, and know that we have hope as we go through every day of our lives, knowing that one day we too will have